Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of UBS Road to the Election, an election watch series. Today in the studio with me is Paul Donovan, Chief Economist for UBS Global Wealth Management. Paul, good to see you.
Good to be here. Thanks, Anthony.
Thanks for coming stateside to sit with me. I know this wasn't the only thing you had going on here while you came to the States from the UK, but we thought it was going to be a perfect opportunity to sit with you because you're obviously someone who is tracking the movements across global economies. And of course, we can't look at US politics and not think about how it pertains or it's thought of by people outside of the country. So what is the sort of the opinion, the thoughts of people outside the US when it comes to US politics, but particularly this election coming up in November?
Well, I think there's a couple of issues we've got here. The first is we've got to recognize that I think the view of politics externally is chaotic. And the reason for that, of course, is we're not watching your politics all of the time. You get 3 minutes on the evening news or maybe 5 minutes perhaps, and that's it. And so what we tend to find is that in the international media, the sensational, the more extreme views are the ones that are being projected. And that can give a distorted view of what's going on in the United States. I think as well, there is, perhaps because of this concentration of time, there's very, very much focus on the presidential election and the other 30,000 elections you guys have got going on in November. Those don't get much of a look in. So a lot of the time, the conversations with clients are very focused on the presidency, not about what might happen in Congress, which of course is extraordinarily important, and even further down the ticket, there's lots of issues which are going to be very dependent on what happens at state outcomes. So I think that there's perhaps a focus on the sensational and there's a focus on the presidency, and in that context as well, inevitably with an international audience, there's a lot of focus on trade and the potential for tariffs and trade taxes and so on and so forth, and foreign policy. What you guys do domestically, we don't really care, to be perfectly honest. The international stuff, that gets a lot of airplay with our clients globally.
Right. And I hear what you mean. What you're saying is because there are the loud politicians that we have in this country. They shall remain nameless on this particular show, but they're probably the ones that are getting that 3 minutes of your airtime in the UK. It's similar to what we get here when it comes to UK politics or European politics. We get the loudest people in Parliament or the Prime Minister, his or herself, and that's pretty much what we know of politics outside the US.
Exactly, and this is why I always say when I'm talking with clients, look, domestic clients always understand their politics better than anybody else. Doesn't matter what country you're in, the locals are going to understand the politics far better because they're getting a far more nuanced, a far more rounded view. But you've got to remember that does mean when international investors are making decisions about the States, they're sort of looking at a cartoon characterization of the political climate that exists here a lot of the time.
Well, that's probably and let's go into what you had been writing about recently, which is you call it economic scapegoating and prejudice politics.
Yep.
And obviously, I've read all of your blogs and listened to your podcast, so I know what this is about. But for the benefit of the audience, talk about those two topics and how they really pertain to what you were just saying. It's about investor attitudes outside of the U.S. towards U.S. investing, and of course, the political environment.
Well, these are traits which are global. They're not by any means unique to the United States, and they come out of the fact that we are in this period of really, really dramatic economic structural change. I would say the fourth industrial revolution, as economists have labeled this is the biggest change in 250 years. This is really dramatic upheaval. And as ever, when we get periods of structural change, some people do better and some people do worse. And the people who are on the way down, they want someone to blame for their misfortune. It's a natural human instinct, particularly because what's causing your social status, your economic status to decline, it's nothing you've done, it's the universe, as it were. It's events outside your control. And so it's very, very tempting to go down the route of scapegoat economics. It's not my fault I've lost my job. It must be the fault of, insert the name of a group. And we can see this around the world. It may be a religious minority, an ethnic minority, maybe foreigners. The British always blame the French, with good reason. It may be sexuality minorities. It doesn't matter what it is. You pick on a group and you blame them. And then, of course, you get the prejudice politics, which is vote for me and we'll build a metaphorical wall. We'll keep that group out. We'll reduce their influence. And then we very often see in this climate a specific form of prejudice politics, which is economic nationalism, because blaming foreigners is very easy, as the British have been doing with the French for 1,000 years. It's very, very easy to blame the foreigner because they're very obviously other, different.
Right.
And the challenge with this, of course, is that this economic nationalism, it's not just something we're seeing in the United States with anti-China tariffs or taxes on US consumers of Chinese products. We're seeing that from both sides of the aisle, but we're seeing this with Europe, we're seeing this with China, we're seeing this with India. We're seeing this globally, this sense of barriers coming up, and that's something we're going to have to navigate as investors over the next few years.
Look, as human beings, we have a very long history of doing exactly what you're talking about, sort of putting people into groups or groups of people into buckets and putting them off to the side and either blaming or thanking, whatever the case may be. So I don't think that it's probably not much of a surprise to anybody listening to you explain that to say, oh, that makes sense. It's something that the history books have been talking about and will continue to write about. But, interestingly, I think one of the big things that we talk about a lot is the fact that there's this sort of single issue politics. And I know you've talked about it as well. And you referenced social media as not completely to blame, but an example of what that is. Because if I go to Instagram or TikTok or wherever, it starts to understand what I generally like or don't like, and then it only will send me after a while the things that I tend to like or agree with, so I never really hear another side of a conversation or an argument or a debate. So is that where that comes from, that sort of single issue voting idea?
Well, so this is compounding the prejudice politics. It's interesting. It's possibly making it worse and better at the same time. Now, it's really interesting. If you look back over the last 3 industrial revolutions, each industrial revolution has also been accompanied by some kind of political revolution. I don't mean you guys so foolishly rebelling against the British Crown. I mean that in the 18th century, you go from court politics focused on the king to the nascent party politics. Even before the US Revolution, you're still looking at the emergence of the Whigs and the Tories in the UK, for example. So that's one example of how political structures change. Now, what's happening in the 4th Industrial Revolution is we are seeing the rise of single issues and the decline of party politics. Almost everywhere in the world, except possibly China, membership of political parties is in decline. And one of the reasons for that is that if you sign up to a political party, you're never going to agree with the entire party manifesto. And so you're having to sort of sign up to views you don't necessarily hold. But social media has allowed us to sort of focus our energies on a single issue, whether that's environment or whether it's social, doesn't matter what it is. If you're passionate about something, there's some kind of Instagram group or WhatsApp message network, whatever it is.
They're talking about it.
Exactly.
Right.
Join on that. And so what this has then done is led to people focusing very, very much on single issues. And so I would say, look, the global 15% minimum corporate tax that we saw introduced by the OECD and extended a couple of years ago, that essentially came out of a single issue social media campaign against Amazon and Starbucks. I mean, it's literally that simple, but that's emerged. Brexit in the UK was a single issue campaign about immigration, essentially. It wasn't really about the European Union and the complexities. It was about we want to control our borders. End of discussion. And so you're seeing this rise, and then you're quite right. You then also get the echo chamber coming in, where you just get your own views repeated back to you, and that can be very, very damaging. So this is something which then helps to fuel prejudice politics very often, because scapegoat economics is simplistic. It tends to be focused on one group or one set of people in society, feeds into that prejudice, fuels very, very much the situation. But it also does make it easier to campaign against some of these issues, because social media can work to bring minorities together as an alternative. So it's not unremittingly bleak news. There is some good news here as well.
Yeah, without getting into the politics of it all, ironically, there's, when you think about these single issues, truth almost has become subjective these days because of what people are hearing, whether it's on a news channel or via TikTok or Instagram, which, in I remember, thinking when I was a kid, watching the news at the end of the night, they spoke factually, but then you go to social media and it's all kinds of misinformation and people take that as fact. So it becomes really difficult to have an educated conversation with somebody who's only listening to one side, and it may not even be the truth, but it's their truth. And so obviously that goes into much more complicated areas of politics, and especially with elections. But one of the areas that I think has been hotly debated, or continues to be, is the state of the economy.
Yeah.
And as our global economist, what is your thought on where we are economically today globally and in the US, and how much of that issue will continue to come up in this election cycle? Because it seems like that's what everybody's really going to. Oh, inflation is too high. I'm paying $10 for a dozen eggs. My mayonnaise jar is $9.99, and it's doubled in a year or less.
Yeah.
What's the thought on that, Paul?
So here's the issue. You've got the economic reality, and then we've got how we as consumers and as voters perceive the economy, and these things are not necessarily the same.
Right.
So the economic reality is actually things are doing pretty well at the moment. We've got inflation has come down pretty much across the board. Now, since the start of 2020, all major economies have had pretty much the same inflation. Europe, US, UK, we're all either side of 20% cumulative inflation over 4 years. And that's quite a lot. That's not what we're used to. But a lot of this was just sort of the post-pandemic boom and then a reversal of that. And so we're now back down to more or less normal inflation rates. And that reduction in inflation has been achieved with no meaningful increase in unemployment. I mean, this is a wonderful economic set of circumstances, but people aren't feeling it. And why are they not feeling it? Well, partly because for a lot of that early period of high inflation, wages didn't keep up. So we would say as economists, negative real wage growth. Now, wages are now growing faster than inflation on both sides of the Atlantic, and that means that people should be feeling more positive, but they're still not, because they're remembering the fact that their wages didn't keep up with inflation. And of course, there's another thing, which is you get a pay rise now. You say, well, that's a pay rise because I'm working better, I'm a better employee. That's not compensating me for inflation. I'm still not being compensated for inflation. People don't like to think about pay rises as just being an offset to the price increases. So there's that perception. We tend to find that people remember prices for about 18 months. So, if you think, well, look, a Snickers bar is supposed to cost $1 and it's now $1.50, you are going to think that's an outrageous price for a year and a half. And only after a year and a half do you sort of mentally reset to know a Snickers bar is supposed to cost $1.50. So that sort of problem comes in. And then the other big issue with inflation specifically is frequency bias. We remember the price of things we buy frequently. So here in the States, that is food and fuel for the family's fleet of sports utility vehicles. So gasoline prices, something everybody remembers because it's something you're seeing every time you walk past a gasoline station. You're seeing the price. You're buying it on a regular basis. Food prices, something you remember very frequently. One of the interesting things here in the United States is that the inflation rate in vending machines is a lot higher than the average inflation rate. And that's also an issue because, of course, vending machines are very high frequency purchases, and you're constantly being reminded every time you go to buy a snack, you're being reminded this costs more than it used to. And that sort of thing affects the inflation perception. Now, I'm not saying prices haven't risen. They have risen, but mentally we feel worse about it because we still think prices should be where they were 18 months ago, and because the things that we buy frequently have tended to rise more in price. The fact that televisions are cheaper than they were in 2019, nobody notices that. The fact that your chocolate bar, your gasoline is more expensive, that you remember.
Right, because you're not buying a television every day,
well, exactly,
like you would potentially a Snickers bar.
Yeah, I mean, even American households have got a finite number of televisions that they need.
I live in a New York City apartment. I only have room for so many TVs.
Exactly.
Paul, thank you very much. I know this can be a very complicated topic, but you're always great at simplifying the difficult down to something that's really tangible and understandable. Always good to see you, Paul Donovan. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Please come back soon. And for more information, please please visit our website, ubs.com/election watch. The other episodes in this particular series are on that website, plus other election-related content, including our CIO publications. And if we would encourage you to continue this conversation, make sure you're talking to your financial advisor for that. Until next time, I'm Anthony Pastore. Wish you a great day, everyone. We'll see you soon.